Hi everyone, going into the 8th round of today's European Team Championships, Alireza Firouzja was searching for an incredible 6th win in a row, and not only that, but looking to leapfrog Ding Liren into the world number 2 spot on the chess live ratings list and break 2800, an incredible barrier, and he's looking to break it at the youngest age of any chess player in history. But today he faced a stern test in Alexander Grischuk, and this is a different caliber of opponent than anyone he's faced so far in this tournament. So Grischuk currently sits at number 10 in the world on the live rating list, an incredibly strong Russian GM who really needs no introduction to anyone in the chess world. So Grischuk had the white pieces today, and this made the challenge even harder for Alireza. So Grischuk opened up here by playing the Ruy Lopez, bringing this bishop out to b5. We had a6, the standard move. Bishop dropped back to a4. Now we had knight to f6, castles from Grischuk, and now an early b5 from Firouzja, just dropping it back a move. Actually, the most common move here by far for black is bishop to e7, although this move b5 has been quite trendy in recent times at the top level. So Grischuk drops the bishop back to b3. We now have bishop to c5, so this is a very aggressive way for black to be playing, bringing the bishop outside of this pawn chain. So after c3 from Grischuk, we have pawn to d6, keeping that bishop outside the pawn chain, and this has the upside of attacking the white king, but the downside of not being able to play a defensive role on e7 and later dropping back into f8 and g7, as is a common maneuver when the bishop stays on e7. So we had d4 now from Grischuk, so an immediate break in the centre, looking to pick up tempo against this bishop on c5, and Alireza doesn't want to chop here because then he'll give Grischuk a really nice centre, so he drops back to b6. We now have bishop to e3, castles from Firouzja, knight b to d2, and now rook to b8 from Firouzja. So this is actually a very interesting move in my opinion. Now, the most common move here, just dropping back a move, is to play pawn to h6, covering this g5 square, which is quite a critical square in a lot of lines, as we'll see. But okay, Alireza plays rook to b8 here, and I think this is quite a deep move really. A common idea from white here is to play pawn to a4, exchanging here, trying to create a weak pawn and also opening the a-file, and I guess Firouzja was looking to avoid that exchange of rooks and potentially try and pressure down the b-file at a later point. So we have h3 from Grischuk, rook to e8 from Firouzja, and we note now that this rook leaves the defence of the f7 square, so it's always something to consider when you leave pawns and weak squares undefended like this. How could my opponent take advantage? So we have rook e1 from Grischuk, now bishop to b7 coming onto this diagonal, a common way of developing in these structures. Knight to g5 now from Grischuk, so eyeing that weakened square, and here Alireza defends in a dynamic way with rook to e7. He doesn't want to go passively back. So we have pawn to d5 now from Grischuk. Another interesting moment. We note that he now chooses to close the centre, which he didn't previously do. And a big part of delaying on this centre closure is the fact that he was waiting for this bishop to develop to b7. The bishop has now developed, come to this diagonal, so Grischuk shuts it down. He does shut down his own bishop, we note, but okay, that can always reroute to c2, a common idea in the Ruy Lopez. Now here Alireza chops the bishops, we have rook takes, we want to maintain our pawn structure, and the knight now drops back to a7. Firouzja could have considered knight to a5 here, but the problem is after bishop to c2, let's say c6 breaking at the centre, well now white can go b4 actually. The knight is forced to jump in, and after this exchange, this is an unfavourable pawn structure for black. This pawn will always be weak, and after white gets a4 in, they're going to have good space on the queen side and the possibility of creating a passed pawn later. So coming back here, the knight dropped back into a7 instead in this position, and now we had this pawn to a4 move, a typical break in these structures, activating the rook and looking to undermine these black pawns on the queen side. And this is a good moment to pause and think about how best to play in this position, and it's very instructive what Firouzja does here. If we look at the board here, then what is the worst piece for black? And the clear answer to that is the knight on a7. Not only is it on the edge of the board, but it also is on the second rank of black. Very, very passive, currently has no jumps. So that's why Firouzja plays knight to c8 here.
He's sending the knight on a journey to improve it, and it's a great positional tip. Always look to improve your worst piece. So we have AB, AB, and now C4 from Grischuk. So he strikes out on the queen side. There was another option here for Grischuk. He could have looked to play something like, say, knight to f1. Again, a typical manoeuvre in these positions, coming to g3 and then f5 to pressure on the king side. But instead, in this position, Grischuk goes for something slightly different. So c4 here, a very direct way to play on the queen side and looking to try and pressure this backwards c7 pawn if possible in future. And that's why Firouzja plays the immediate c6 here. He doesn't want to be straddled with that weak backwards pawn for too long, and this pawn on d5 is cramping the black position, so it needs to be undermined at some point, especially if we're going to liberate this bishop on b7. So we have dc, bishop recaptures. Now the pawn takes on b5, bishop recaptures again, and this is a great moment to pause and take stock of the position and think about the best way to play. Again, there are some different options here for Grischuk, but he has to be careful. This pawn on b2, whilst it could be a strength in the endgame as an outside passed pawn, at this stage it's more of a weakness, with this rook on b8 already eyeing down that file, the other rook ready to swing across quite quickly, the queen could even join the game, ganging up on that pawn. So Grischuk plays something here which really takes the fight to Firouzja, and it shows the quality of his understanding of these positions. So he plays bishop takes f7. Now this might look like a very strange move because we don't normally want to give up two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn. The minor pieces are usually stronger, but Grischuk's seen a bit deeper here, that he can gain a good initiative from making this sacrifice. So after the rook recaptures, now Grischuk chucks in the intermezzo move, queen to b3, adding a pin here. This now forces black to play d5, because if, for example, black defended with the queen, let's say with queen to e8, now we can simply chop, because after the queen recaptures, now we can simply play rook to a5, hitting this bishop twice and using the fact that it's pinned to the rook here on b8. And if black tries to, say, swap the queens here, well, we can capture back with the rook and maintain the pin here. So black's in a lot of trouble after playing like this. So that's why coming back here, the immediate d5 is forced. Now we have knight takes on f7, king recaptures, pawn takes in the middle, again forced. You can't allow black to go d4 here. Then we have queen takes on d5, queen recaptures, knight recaptures, and now rook takes on e5, picking up that pawn. And now that the smoke has cleared, we can take stock of the position. So we can see that these two rooks are facing off to each other. We have the two knights facing off, and then Grischuk has rook and two pawns versus bishop and knight here. Now, which is better can depend on the position, but in this kind of position here, we favour the rooks. We can see that there's lots of open lines all down the board, which is really helping the rooks. The minor pieces are a bit discoordinated here, and black is also lacking a pawn or two on the queen side. Say they had a pawn on c6, then that would massively help with creating outposts for these minor pieces, because the minor pieces need outposts to work very effectively. And so black is really struggling to coordinate here, plus the king is exposed. So for all these factors, Grischuk's slightly better, but not by much. So we have knight f6, Firouzja drops back, trying to give that king some cover and sort out this undefended piece. Knight to e4 now, jumping in, and Firouzja now plays knight to d7. So he doesn't play the exchange here. He's basically trying to keep some pieces on at this stage and keep some cover around his king. Also ask a question of this rook to see how Grischuk wants to play. So Grischuk goes rook to d5. We now have bishop to c6, getting to a more active diagonal and also opening up the b line for the rook. We have rook to d2 now, and there's a nice tactic here. If the bishop captures the knight, we take this knight here with check, and we're coming in on the 7th rank, which is very dangerous. So that's why Firouzja in this position instead played knight to e5 here, centralising the knight and looking at these sensitive squares. Now we had rook to e1 from Grischuk, and this actually isn't the most accurate move. So Grischuk could have started quite a dangerous initiative here with knight to g5, checking the king, and also hitting this h7 pawn. Say black were to go king to g6, looking to hold on to that pawn and hitting the knight. Well, now Grischuk would have the powerful move f4, bolstering this knight, hitting this one, and also allowing the knight to stay on g5 where it eyes e6 and f7, and you can even start to create mating nets against the black king if you're not careful here.
So say black played knight c4, just getting away from this e5 square, hitting the rook. Well, now we have rook to d4, and again this knight is kind of stumbling around. If black played a terrible move like taking the pawn here, then we have rook to a6, and we're hitting this bishop, which is pinned to the king. So these are the problems with the discoordinated pieces, no pawn cover, and an exposed king. So if we run back here, that isn't what Grischuk played. After knight e5, he went rook to e1, and the players were getting short of time here, it should be noted. So after rook to e1, Firouzja actually just sought to simplify now. So he chopped off this tricky knight, the rook recaptured. Now he played this knight into c6. We had rook to d3 here, and we note that black doesn't take this pawn on b2, because otherwise we're going rook f3 and say king to g6 here. Then we're going rook e6 and picking up the knight on c6. And if the black king were to drop back to g8, well, now we're simply checkmating with rook to e8. So coming back here, that's why Firouzja doesn't take the pawn. Instead, he plays knight 8 to e7. We have pawn to b3 now from Grischuk, king to g8, pawn to g3, knight to f5, king to g2, and now knight f to d4, offering Grischuk a simplification if he wants it. And there's not really much else to be done here for Grischuk. So we had rook takes, knight takes, rook recaptures, rook takes pawn, and here we can see we have a dead drawn position with 3-on-2 on the king side, and this is just a theoretical draw. So this was move 37, and they actually played on to move 86 with Grischuk trying to find a way through, but it finished peacefully in a draw. So today wasn't the day that Firouzja was able to break through and hit that 2800 rating, but still a very solid performance against the top GM. To watch another amazing Firouzja game, click here, and to never miss another video, subscribe here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you again on the next.